Thank you so much. So I'm Ron Crabtree, and I'll be the moderator, if you will, for this panel discussion and for the most amazing people I know, and we'll introduce them here in a bit. But one thing that I've noticed this year, and at least 100 different conversations with professionals in all industries, that nobody escaped this COVID pandemic unscathed. But I kind of felt like there was three basic buckets of folks, right? There was organizations that actually got lift in demand and all kinds of craziness in their supply chain. There was folks that saw demand overall maybe pretty level, but lots of swings or maybe, some crazy disruption stuff going on. And then there was the third group of people that their demand was crushed, and just talk about a bad problem. And then of course, food supply chain has been a big concern too. We're going to be touching on all four of those areas as we make our way through this webinar. So our topical areas that we're going to get into here is we're going to start with a couple of polling questions. We'd like to understand our audience and just very quickly capture, on a high to low basis, how have you been affected on the demand side? We're kind of curious how the audience looks on that. And then how much disruption you think you've experienced. And then from there, each of our panelists will take one of those four categories I mentioned and kind of break them down. We have three different questions we'll work through. And then with the last question, being what would you do about it? We're going to take a little extra time in this webinar and give each panelist a little extra time to talk about what do we do going forward to deal with those issues. And then we'll wrap with a polling question at the end, try to get a sense of what you'd like to learn more about after this webinar. So with that, I'm going to give each of the panelists an opportunity to introduce themselves. We'll start with Jim DeVries. If you could unmute and introduce yourself to the audience, Jim.
Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, everyone. I'm honored to be here. I appreciate it with such an esteemed group of folks in Ron and NLPA. My 35 years have been focused on enabling companies to perform at their fullest from a strategy and execution perspective and to build a resilient enterprise. And so we have EIG and Supply Chain Risk Management Consortium is represented here with 40 exemplar companies. So next.
Awesome. Awesome. Good job. Let's move on to Jim Gitney.
Good day, everyone. Thank you so much, Ron and NLPA, for having me. It's my pleasure. I'm the CEO of Group 50 Consulting, formed in 2004. We're subject matter experts in supply chain and strategy for middle market companies, primarily focused in the manufacturing and distribution arena. We are incredibly busy with our clients, helping them redefine their 2020 and 2021 strategies, as well as creating supply chain resilient supply chains, and also managing their next 90 days. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, the next 90 days, we definitely want to be thinking about that. So Bruce.
Thanks a lot for having me today. Looking forward to the discussions we're having. I'm Bruce Simmell. I'm the managing partner of Flow Consulting. Flow's been around about 23 years. We focus on transforming organizations through performance improvement. Similar to Jim, we primarily work in the manufacturing and distribution arena. We've worked with everything from large multinational companies to small to mid-size domestic firms. And looking forward to having the dialogue we're going to have today. Appreciate it.
Awesome. Thank you. David.
Hello, everyone. I'm David Millington. I'm the Director of Product Development and Education for Next Level Purchasing Association. I bring close to 20 years of experience in the supply chain arena with specializations in strategy, product development, and continuous improvement.
All right, awesome, good job. And many of the people attending probably know me already, but I had about a 20-year career mainly in the automotive industry and supply chain and operations, and have worked for the last 20 years in the consulting sector and been involved a lot with thought leadership and Lean Six Sigma and supply chain and what it takes to be an excellent organization. And I'm just really here to facilitate and let these four awesome people share their best stuff. So we're going to start with two polling questions. Amber's going to take presenter and run these. The first one is this. We'll read this first and then we'll pop it. You get to pick one. So when you think about demand, let's see, get this right. Yeah, this is with respect to demand and what happened to you, which of these four buckets, right? Volumes went up, volumes were consistent, but there was, you know, a little bit of variation, or our volumes are consistent and there was a lot of variation. We'd like to differentiate between small variation, big variation, and demand. And then finally, we've been crushed. And then the second polling question, which we'll move to pretty quickly, well, that way we're not flipping presenters again. The second polling question, which Amber will run and we'll share the results, with respect to the amount of disruption you've occurred, which of these three best matches your situation, right? Massive disruption, big mushroom cloud. Yeah, it's been manageable. Yeah, we've had some sleepless nights, but we're getting through it. Or, it's not a bit, right? That'll be the second polling question. With that, back over to Amber to run the polling questions.
And as I launched this, so I just realized that the second option is listed twice. So please take that in consideration. Just choose one.
Okay, very good. So you get three choices. Either our volumes increase, it was consistent, or it decreased. So you get to pick one of those, and we'll give the audience a chance to weigh in on that, and then Amber will share the results. Yeah, we usually let this run for about 30 seconds because it takes a little while. We had quite a large number, very large number of registrants. So there's quite a number of people here in our webinar today. So we take an extra minute for the technology to let everybody get their input in. So we'll give Amber a chance to monitor the string of the string of responses.
Looks like they've ended, so I'm going to go ahead and post the polling result.
Thank you. Interesting. So we have that's an interesting phenomena here. I didn't expect this, that 62% of the total audience are kind of in that, we'll call it the crush category, where demand took a real nosedive. And then we have about 16% say, yep, we're part of the grouping that got some significant lift. And then everybody else, which is about 23%, would say, well, we're kind of sailing along here from a volume perspective. So thank you for that. Bruce, these folks are really going to be interested in what you've got to say a little deeper in this webinar. So great. Let's run the other polling question next. That one was talk about the variation, right? The amount of disruption, if you will. Amber, if you could run that second polling question, please.
It's open now.
Oh, awesome. So again, we'll cool our heels here for a moment, right? Mushroom cloud, not so bad, or no, not really a problem at all.
I'm going to go ahead and stop the polling now.
Thank you. Now this is interesting. This is very interesting. You know, I was expecting to see a bigger number on the massive disruption side of it, because I heard so many stories about have a supplier in Italy that shut us down, right? Stuff like that. You know, people jumping out their bedroom windows because suppliers are going bankrupt because of this, and like, who are we going to get supply from? But vast majority, 63%, saying, you know, we're managing through it pretty good. Hasn't been fun. Very few say there's, like 8% say there was no disruption. So they're definitely in the minority for our audience. So thank you. And it gives us as panelists and an idea of kind of who our audience is and where they're being impacted. So with that, we can close that out. And if you can pass presenter back to me, Amber. And we'll move on to the grouping. So let me explain the groupings, and then each of the panelists is tackling one of these, right? So grouping number one would be organizations that saw some lift. Grouping number two would be those that said, you know, it's pretty steady volume, but maybe there's, you know, some mixed swings, and it's been a bit of a headache because of the mixture of products and services are swimming. And then food supply chain is a big concern, because having people starve to death in a situation like this is really scary. So David's going to be tackling that one. But backing up, by the way, Jim DeVries is really going to focus in on the lift. Jim Gitney is going to kind of address really key things around folks that had a fairly level as far as demand goes. David's going to focus specifically on the food supply chain. And then Bruce is going to be tackling the biggest chunk of our audience, is saying, we got crushed. and what happens to us, right, going forward. So let's get into those three questions. I'm going to rotate who takes the questions first on each of the three, just to make it interesting. And the first question coming out with Jim going first, Jim DeVries, then Jim Gitney, David Millington, and Bruce. For your focus industry, which for Jim DeVries will be, I got Lyft, what are the top three reasons for the disruption that organizations have seen, and how was that manifested? Take it away, Jim.
Thanks, Ron. So the way we looked at it here is, from a setup perspective, of course, the shutdown occurred. All the facilities and public places had their constraints, no ingress, no egress. So limiting the movement of goods. The constraints drove broken supply chains, different product mixes, leading to the supply-demand imbalances. And of course, anything that's overseas with long lead times spawned new products and services for some companies. So that could be a demand lift for some companies. It may be just to survive. So we really summarize it as CPG, the consumer, grocery store, and the methods to get it there would be the main focus. And of course, in the healthcare industry, the COVID, supporting the COVID.
Yeah, supporting the COVID would be one side of it, and then all the elective surgeries getting shut off was the others. It was not a fun time to be in the medical industry.
That's right. So they're very in that first part of the oscillation of not having too much supply, too much demand. They experience both ends of the spectrum, as you see on the chart.
All right, good job, Jim. Let's move on now. Jim Gitney.
So I'd like to add a couple more pieces to what Jim DeVries was saying. The world of supply chain, and every business has one, whether you're a product manufacturer or a services provider. You take raw inputs, you add value to it, and you sell it to your end consumer. Lead times have increased anywhere between 20 and 300%, depending on the industry. And so it makes planning incredibly important. And even with companies with flat demand, there's been lack of consistency in reopening, and every state and every government and every local leader has their own ways of reopening and doing things. So it's incredibly important that you stay in close contact with your customers and what their needs are, like I said, whether it's products or services, and understand what's happening downstream in your supply chain. We've lost reliability, and with significantly increased lead times, it makes it more difficult to plan your future. The last piece I'd like to mention on this one is changing buying patterns. And so while demand may have remained flat, demand from bricks and mortar like Walmart and others has gone down significantly. But all of us have seen a drastic increase in the products that are being ordered via the internet and e-commerce, which puts a completely different set of strains on our business as we're attempting to try and manage through this.
Awesome. Good job. Thank you. David, food supply chain.
Yeah, so we've all seen the massive impact on the food supply chain, some of the meat packing companies, and a lot of food rotting in the fields. So, and this is I guess the result of three things that I want to discuss as to what has put us in that position. Firstly, there seems to have been a lack of capacity to get buy-in for the design of disruption or supply disruption mechanisms and planning. And as a result of that lack of planning and understanding of the business landscape and all of the factors and potential disruptors and the magnitude of impacts that could be suffered at the hand of those disruptors, there were limited response mechanisms because our planning to respond to those types of situations were compromised and very limited. So lack of supply disruption planning, lack of response planning mechanisms, is a result of lack of visibility, or would result in lack of visibility, particularly in food supply chains. And one of the key elements of how these systems work: supply disruption planning, supply disruption response planning. One of the key underpinnings there is conducting environmental scans, where we would have a heads up on a continuous basis of those potential disruptors, whether they come from political dimensions, they come from ecological dimensions, product dimensions, fiscal dimensions. We would have had an understanding of what's trending in those spaces, what are the potential impacts, and how well are the organizations positioned to deal with those situations.
Excellent. Good job. Thank you. And let's turn it over to Bruce to take that last bucket. Same question.
So you've heard a lot of kind of similar things from the other panelists, but when we think about those of you who have been hardest hit by the COVID from a negative standpoint, really kind of summarizes down into two issues. Obviously, the mandated shutdowns in the US and abroad, and Jim touched earlier on about kind of the chaotic way we're reopening across the US and across the globe. So those things are really seeing dramatic drop in demand in key industries such as auto, tourism, in any industry in some areas that was deemed non-essential. So along with all that is the whole supply chain reliability issue that we're all seeing, the longer lead time. So, but one of the interesting things, and Jim Gitney also touched on this, is in some industries, the industry itself is relatively flat, but those of you that may be getting hit hard are getting hit because the demand, we're seeing weird demand shifts. And the example I've got here is kind of in the food industry, tying into what David was talking about, where we've moved from less commercial food processing to more retail food processing. And if you were a supplier of bulk packaging for commercial restaurants and commercial food, you saw your business just disappear. And the retail packaging folks saw a huge lift. And often those are different companies. At a minimum, they're usually different plants. So those things are really driving some of the big negative disruptions that those of you who are really feeling the impact of COVID. Back to you, Ron. Ron, you're on mute.
One of the hazards of having a little tickle in my throat. Sorry about that. So excellent answers. Thank you. This kind of tees up question number 2. For each of these 4 areas respectively, what's likely to happen, opportunities and threats in the next quarter, right? That we need to kind of be thinking about as we begin to climb our way out of this whole phenomena of the pandemic. And what are the top 3 scenarios that you think can unfold for each of these 4 categories that we talked about? We're going to start with Jim Gitney this time, which would be flat demand organizations, followed by David around, food supply chain, then Bruce for those who kind of got crushed, and then back to Jim for the ones that saw a lift. So with that, we're going to turn it over to Jim for this question.
Hello again. What's likely to happen? The path is really clear, isn't it? We just truly don't know. We don't know whether there's going to be a second wave. We don't know what is actually going to happen. So for companies that are flat, you're likely going to see more consistent demand now that distribution channels have settled down. As Bruce pointed out, manufacturers have rejuggled their SKU mix and are focusing more on the SKUs that they are going to likely sell, and forgetting about the ones that they were hoping to sell sometime in the future. We are going to see improving supply chain reliability. We will likely see more normal patterns over the next few quarters in consumer products and consumer staples, right? But the recovery curve for every business is going to be completely different, even if you have flat demand. And so it's important that you are focused on planning the balance of a year and reducing the number of choices that people have and focusing on the product you sell well, you have good margins on, and you're going to be able to move.
All right, awesome. Thank you that was a very concise too. Thank you. Excellent. Well, with that, we're going to move on to David, and let's talk a little bit about the food supply chain.
So what I expect to see in the next short-term period is procurement departments protecting themselves. So they're going to really examine critically the contractual languages that they use, and wherever necessary, deploy force majeure clauses, or at least to bolster those clauses. So you'll see a heavy interaction between procurement and legal environments, which would also result in, and I could foresee procurement departments acquiring the skill sets to handle the next few years out, particularly the immediate responses. I could see a heavy, we have already seen a heavy request for training around risk management and disruption planning. Also on the food side, I would expect, and I'm hearing some chatter about increased regulation, or especially on the food safety side. We've seen what has happened at some of the meat plants. So bodies like SQF, Safe Quality Foods, BRC, and the local health departments, I could see where they would, number one, be potentially an increase in audits and the magnitude of those audits. And so companies would have to make sure that their staffs are properly trained and equipped to deal with that type of regulation. And of course, on the procurement side, how do we do all of this and keep the cost structure intact? Is it compliance at whatever cost, or are we going to do it at a reasonable cost? So those are some of the critical things that I foresee.
Awesome. Good job. Thank you. Let's move on now
Ron,
to.
Can I
Yes.
interrupt quickly? We've got a couple of questions. One is, my company has seen where some items are being demanded more now than others. The sales and marketing teams are reacting by increasing forecasts. However, my concern is that this may not be sustainable. How do you manage this process?
Raise a hand, panelists. Who wants to tackle that first?
I could take a jump at that.
Okay.
One of the things that was touched on earlier is understanding the complexity of those particular products. So if there are products that would bring a tremendous amount of design, logistical complexities, then you have to reconsider that if it's sustainable or not. So the mere fact to say that something is not sustainable, I think we have to assemble the correct criteria to make those decisions, whether they're sustainable or not. And of course, embedded in those criteria would be disruption resilient products, or resiliency, and other factors.
Right. Any other panelists care to comment on that? Go ahead, Jim.
So Ron, I'll jump into this. When you're seeing this kind of demand change, it's incredibly important that you go to what we call sales and operational planning sprints, weekly reviews of what's happening in your marketplace and with your suppliers. And if your marketing and salespeople are increasing their forecast, be very, very inquisitive as to what the basis of that is and what the probability of it is. And with one of our clients, what we've done is in their forecast actually put probabilities of that volume actually happening, or that order being received from a big box retailer, for example. And that is going to give you a much better sense of what that, of the validity of that forecast. And remember, as David pointed out, it's going to be different in every industry, and dependent on where your demand is coming from.
All right, so we're gonna stop there because we're actually getting into question number 3 already, which is cool. What was the other question, Amber?
Well, the other 3 that I've received are industry specific. The first one is the oil and gas industry. I've been on one of the most severely hit industries. Can any of the panelists throw light on the turnaround process in the next 6 months?
Bruce, that sounds like that's you.
We actually do a lot of work in the oil and gas industry, and we've seen our clients just really hurting right now. With the global economy going down, there's really no big expectation for a huge increase in oil and gas in the next 3 to 6 months. I think most firms in that space have got to be prepared to weather a longer haul than a lot of the things we're talking about today. They've got more dynamics going on than just COVID. So those that are being, especially on the industrial oil and gas side, if you're making things that are tied to exploration and that type of thing, that industry is probably a year away from really starting to turn and grow again.
Yeah, Amber, was there another bit of that question?
Not for that one, but there was one about the health supply chain. Is it food or health supply chain which is more highly affected by COVID-19?
Jim DeVries, you want to take a crack at that one?
Yeah, so I think for the healthcare, it's the products that are feeding into the COVID-19, where you're seeing the recovery drugs, the monitors, the masks. That's where you're seeing the big lift right now. And the food is, we all have to eat. And as David said, we have to figure out where we're going to get that food. If we can't go to the restaurant, we're going to go to, we're going to have to make our food ourselves at the grocery store. So the packaging and that product mix is going to change. So there's going to be a lot of tumultuous turns here in those supply chains. So I'd be very careful about any predictions in these areas, because the new norm, we don't know what it is. It's going to keep changing.
Yeah, I mean, like the industries that were focused, they had their cold chain focused in on supplying restaurants, right, got crushed when the ones with cold chain going direct to consumers are going nuts, right?
Yep.
So, whoa, the business model gets totally flipped. So, Amber, was that good enough on that for now?
Yes, thank you guys so much.
All right, perfect, good job. Thank you, everybody. So we're going to get back to this question too, right? What's likely to happen in that next quarter? Only now we're going to flip over to Bruce and talk about the companies that have kind of been crushed. Take it away, Bruce.
Okay, so it's interesting someone brought up oil and gas, because when I was actually working on this, I intentionally kind of ignored oil and gas because they've got factors going on that are much broader than COVID, the COVID situation that we're really focused on. So I feel for those of you on the call that are in that industry, because there's multiple dynamics going in impacting you right now. But when we think about those firms that are being hardest hit by COVID right now, so what's going to happen to them over the next quarter, 2 quarters? We feel very strongly that in most situations they're going to see a rebound from where they are right now. But if you're on, there's going to be some wins and losses in this. And if you're on the loss side, the losses are probably going to be 10% or greater. We're expecting GDP to be down 3 to 10%. So if you're one of the ones that's not getting it, that's not getting the lift, you're probably going to be below that 10%, because you're going to be offsetting folks that are getting lift. So we think you should plan on a rebound, but don't expect to be at last year's numbers. We also, even though we're starting to see some stability, we're also seeing some disruptions and surprises by suppliers going out of business, and unexpectedly. And if you think about it, if you're hurt, your suppliers are hurt. So you may be surprised by that supplier that's having cash issues that you wouldn't have expected to. So you may be weathering it, but they may not be. So definitely, as we talk about solutions, that's an area we got to spend some time thinking about. And then obviously we've talked about this before, but we feel pretty strongly that supplier lead time fluctuations are going to still continue. The global supply chain continues to be unpredictable. If we do have a backlash in some countries, we could see countries closing up again. And an interesting thing that we're seeing that we didn't expect is, even with the high unemployment we're seeing right now, we're still seeing labor challenges in some pockets of markets throughout the United States. Some of these industries that are getting lifts are getting very significant lifts and creating labor shortages on a localized basis. So something to be thinking about when you're talking with your suppliers. It's surprising to be saying that with 15, 20% unemployment, but we came from a very tight labor market, and it still exists in some places. So,
especially if all the jobs are being created in a particular niche.
Exactly.
Those people available.
Yes.
Yep. Cool. Excellent.
Good.
Great job, Bruce. So Jim DeVries, let's let you do cleanup here. What about the folks that saw some significant lift?
Yeah, so I'd probably build in a lot to what Jim said, but I would focus on that we're going to be seeing a W recovery overall. versus a V recovery, because these supply demand are going to be syncing up, so to speak, and trying to sync up, and then there'll be a surge. So the point I'm trying to make there is that if you are seeing a lift now, you may see a downturn. So don't get too overconfident here in where the things are going. Also, watch your maverick spend. Everybody's trying to get things done quickly. If you're in a high demand area, you want to be looking at that maverick spend. And a digital twin would be a really nice addition if you were to focus on that. And then you're going to have these oversupply, and again, these risk reward cost margin benefit areas that you need to be focusing on. And again, your new products, watch out coming out. You might want to sunset some of your old products, but you need to make sure that you're not sunsetting it for the wrong reason. Also, you would also want to be looking at, if you had been doing any SKU rationalization, how you fan out from there. So again, everything goes to zero by Joel Balker a number of years ago. Expect the unexpected.
All right, awesome. Good job, Jim. We're going to move on now to the third question, and each of the panelists are going to get a little extra airtime here if they want to develop it a bit. So for your area of focus, this is where the rubber meets the road. That's why people are in this webinar. Yeah, this is great, but what do we do? What are the top 3 tactics and actions that we could do? What are the key benefits? How could we measure that? What are the takeaways for our audience today? This time we're going to ask David to go first, followed by Bruce, and then Jim DeVries and Jim Gitney to take it from here. So David, let's take a crack at this.
Yes, so as I mentioned before, we have to be involved as procurement and supply chain professional intensive environmental scan. And when I say environmental scan, I mean understanding the supply chain and overall business landscapes that we're mandated to procure for. So with that said, that a thorough environmental scan has many elements. It's again a thorough understanding of all the political factors that could potentially drive disruption, ecological factors, the technological factors, especially around cybersecurity concerns and the risks that come from those environments, understanding our competitors, and understanding product dynamics, understanding all of the legal factors that could cause some type of disruption. So the key undertaking with a comprehensive environmental scan and understanding our landscapes are what's trending, what's currently trending, and then what are the impacts of those trends on our supply chains and procurement mechanisms. And then an assessment on how well our supply chains and our procurement functions position to address those trends. If it's something that's positive, to capitalize on it. If it's something that we foresee that will have a negative impact, how are we positioned to address those impacts and to respond to those impacts. So, and again, using the outputs of that environmental scan into our disruption planning mechanisms, right? So we design our disruption strategies with this intel, and it's a continuous gathering of information as far as the environmental scanning processes go. So it's not like a yearly thing that's done. It's a continuous thing, and we all have to assess the degree of frequency in which we do the scanning and who is responsible for scanning. So someone, if it's we see fiscal impacts, then I guess the CFO, director of finance, will handle that area. If we foresee some type of ecological impacts, then maybe the director of safety and environmental health and safety. If we see some type of negative impacts from a cyber side, the cybersecurity side, of course, the director of IT. And they're responsible for gathering that intel and providing that intel to all the key stakeholders. So in response to how do we source and how do we procure and how do we handle our supply chains with the experiences that we have had in this whole COVID era, Next Level Purchasing Association came up with the SFIART model. And where we would have a thorough assessment on our disruption categories. Again, that will come from the environmental scans that we do. And of course, a thorough understanding of the markets, the business requirements, and the customer needs and requirements. Those are the underpinnings of this. And then we would measure the impact, the degree of impact that any one of those disruptors could cause on our supply chain. And in particular, and we prioritize those impacts and we assign a number so we understand the magnitude. Potential disruptor number one has an order of magnitude of a certain amount, number two, a certain amount. So this way we prioritize them. And then we do a thorough analysis on what are the root causes of disruptions that we have had, or if we do some type of scenario planning where we would expect a certain degree of risk priority number, what are the potential root causes of why those potential disruptions would occur. And then, of course, we did the response mechanism and the response plans, right? So at that level, if we do detect some, or we go through some type of situation where we foresee a disruption, we have our response mechanisms.
All right, awesome job, David. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Now, just as a spoiler alert, we're going to have another polling question. Each of these three things that each of the panelists are talking about, you're going to get a chance to weigh in on which of those you'd like to learn more about. So kind of keep these in mind as we get to the last polling question here in about another 10 minutes or so. All right, with that, we're going to move over to Bruce. And, the companies have kind of been crushed because of this. What's the top three takeaways?
So, you're going to hear a lot of similarities from the four of us on kind of what the top three areas are around what you should do next. But, we see the first thing you really need to do is you need to stress test your supply chain. And it's about sitting down and talking to people. It's not a matter of just sending out emails and getting questionnaires. You're going to need to talk to your key vendors. How are they doing? Have a candid discussion. How's their cash? Remember, this is the scenario where you're hurting. If you're hurting, they're probably hurting. So you want to make sure you're having a very open dialogue with them. But at the same time, this is also the time to be thinking, who's my backups? Where am I going to go if my supplier does get in trouble? What if I can't get something out of China for 6 months? One of my clients recently was going through this exercise. They're actually on the opposite end where they've got a big lift, but one of their scenarios actually was, we can actually get some of these things at Amazon if we have to. Don't want to, but we know it's there. So it's knowing what the options are for all your materials that you maybe need to bring in. The next one I want to talk about is the don't panic and drop inventories. And I almost put this first. There are some industries that as soon as there's a downturn, their immediate reaction is drop inventories. And one of our clients called up and said, hey, we're going to do this. We're going to back off on some of our key raw spend right away. And we sat there and talked about it a little bit and said, we don't know when the rebound's going to happen, but we do expect it. We also don't know if the lead times are going to all of a sudden double on us. Are we willing to reduce inventories with those two risk factors and then miss a rebound? And trying to recognize that in the short term, those inventories are going to protect you and hopefully prepare you for the rebound. And there's plenty of time, later in this year when things are starting to settle, as we're starting to do, looking back into our planning process, looking at 2021, 2022, to adjust inventory to kind of a new plan. But in the short term, doing that drastic drop, I kind of equate it to people who drop out of the stock market when it's going down and then try to time it coming back up. We all know the story about the people that write it down and write it back up do much better. And I think inventory is one of those cases right now because the bounce backs are going to be unpredictable. And if you're not prepared for it, you're going to lose out on it. And then the last thing, and Jim Gitney touched on this earlier, this is the time to take a hard look at your planning process. Is it sufficient to handle the situation that you're in? Do you need to do something? Do you need to make some adjustments to the process? And at a minimum, you probably need to be increasing the frequency. If you're using an S&OP process, I love Jim's comment earlier about the S&OP sprint. moving it from a monthly process to a twice a month process. If you're a firm that does more of a quarterly planning process, flip that to a monthly planning process, but increase the frequency and look and make sure the process is doing what it needs for you to do in more of the short term. So some of these long-term processes that are typically looking out 6, 12, 18 months, we've got to use those same tools, but now be looking out, 6, 8, 12 weeks to be managing the situation. And then lastly, go to your suppliers and bring them into those processes if you haven't done that already. Having a supplier sitting in on one of your S&OP meetings and seeing how you are addressing the economic situation, understanding how you're thinking about it, is going to give them a lot more faith to do what they need to do to support you going forward. So having them really kind of bonding that planning process together with them right now is probably really important.
All right, cool. And before we move on, I just wanted to piggyback one little thing that I've been hearing, that 3 months ago, some companies overreacted, suppliers, right? And they said, you know what, we're going to lay off everybody we possibly can because we think we're going to get crushed. And then it didn't get crushed. In the meantime, all these people found other jobs, they decided to retire, whatever, and now they have a talent gap, big time, and it's constraining their ability to take advantage. They didn't get the dip they expected or the lift. And that's another phenomena that you need to understand about your suppliers too. So we're going to go ahead and move on and try to get to Q&A here pretty quick. But let's move on to the next bit. We're going to let Jim DeVries jump back in here. What happens if you got the upside? What are the top 3 things in the next quarter we really need to be looking at?
Yeah, so especially you're running so fast, you're in this demand lift. So, I put in there safety first. Just don't forget about safety. Slow down, and just as a salient point there. Again, the Maverick spend that I brought up before, just to be clear, what tends to happen with these supply chain disruptions is spend under $2,000. Either you crush it and you say everything has to get approved, or you keep your spend rates at the same and people figure out how to spend more money, and all of a sudden you have a plethora of suppliers, and all of a sudden your costs are going out of control without knowing it. So that's what I meant on monitoring your Maverick spend and making sure you're limiting that. And again, a digital twin, if you have a digital twin, that's something that can help bring light to that. So it encourage folks to start thinking about that if you don't have that digital twin to bring that transparency to that data. The next is a theme that I think everyone has mentioned is, connecting to those key suppliers and customers and building that bond and relationship, making sure you're having those meetings, and you're going to have to communicate twice as much as you think you need to get everybody aligned, because these, as everybody has mentioned on the supply and demand cycles, S&OP, we're going to be going through a lot of transient times here, and really the new normal. We don't know what it's going to look like, and every industry is going to be different, as many has mentioned here. And then you want to prioritize your key new products. So if you do have new products, make sure that in this new normal, where are they going to be going? Are they temporary, or are they going to be long term? And then align your vendors in agreements. And this is maybe a good time to update your agreements with all your vendors. And at the end of the day, we got to safeguard our cash conversion cycle. So don't get too ahead of yourself, and drive that visibility across your supply chain.
Awesome. Wow. Okay. Well, we're going to have Jim Gitney here do a little cleanup for us, I think. I think Jim's the last panelist on this question. Yeah. So Jim, how about, the companies that maybe didn't see something? Maybe it's not from a volume perspective, a non-event, but what about them?
Well, I think for companies that are flat, they have an interesting problem, because depending on what the recovery model looks like, and every industry is going to be different, whether it's a W, a V, or an incredibly long U like the cruise lines, they're going to have to make sure that they've done scenario planning throughout their supply chain. What happens if it goes up? what happens if it goes down. So I'm cruising along here with flat demand, and what happens if it goes up and what happens if it goes down. And with our clients, we're actually developing those scenario plans with trigger points that say, when we get to this point, here are the additional actions we're going to take, whether it's on the upside or the downside. So that's an incredibly important tactic. The other piece is that even with companies with flat demand, the next 90 days are going to be incredibly important, because that's where they actually are redefining the future of their business. So the panelists, Bruce and Jim and David have all commented about opportunities in the marketplace that hadn't been there before. Competitors that have gotten weaker, that they can take advantage of and increase their sales to gain market share. Or perhaps there is a competitor that is weaker and it's a perfect acquisition opportunity. So they need to be thinking about, what is the forecast for their industry? What are some of the scenarios that might happen, V, W, U, whatever, and then create scenarios around it. And that's what's most important in the next 90 days. And you start with a zero-based model and go up and down and define what your next actions are going to be as you hit each trigger point. Now, I think the next most important piece around the tactical thing is to redefine your 2020 and 2021 strategies. Usually companies will wait until the end of the year to talk about 2021. We don't have that time today. We no longer have the luxury of waiting to the year end. So with some of our clients, we've actually gone to bi-weekly and monthly strategic planning sprints as well. Why? Well, given the significant emotional and financial event that has occurred, we're in this incredible change management environment where everyone is willing to significantly change what they do. Think about how you've changed in the last 30 days or 120 days. And if I'd ask you to do all your meetings on Zoom in February, you'd say, no way, I have to press the flesh and I have to go meet my suppliers. Well, guess what? We've now all become accustomed to Zoom. So when you're sitting and thinking about what in the flat demand arena or any other one, when you're sitting and thinking about what you're going to do in the next 90 days and in your 2020 strategy, don't be afraid to ask, because we're all in the same boat together. There's no class distinction here. Your vendors and your customers are willing to listen to things that may significantly change the industry and be much more willing to do that. And the last piece of advice that I'll provide is that rethink what your products are and what adjacent markets you can serve and what what market share you can take away from your existing competitors.
All right. Wow, I'm blown away with what a fantastic, coverage of all the potential scenarios that any one company could experience all of those, depending on, how big they are and what kind of products they're involved with. So we're going to get to the last polling questions. You got to stretch your brains here. We had 12 different really important things our panelists have talked about in this polling question, which we'll run in a moment. You get to pick as many of these as you like, but we want feedback. What would I like to know more about? What am I really interested in learning more about? We would love that feedback. So we're going to run a polling question and give the audience a chance to pick as many of those as you think are important, and we're looking for that feedback. So Amber, if you can run that polling question now, please. All right, very good. So we have that on screen. And you can just kind of work your way down through there and pick the ones that really kind of catch your eye that, I need to know more about that, or I find that particularly interesting. So we're going to give you, good 20 to 30 seconds to work your way through this. It's a pretty lengthy list, 12 different things. And I think you can scroll down in the polling panel to get to the additional ones, because there's more than will fit in the single view.
We'll leave it open for another 10 seconds so the last few can get their answers in.
Thank you, Amber.
coming to an end now.
Thank you. Okay. Supply chain disruption strategies seem to hit the high point. And a lot of our panelists were definitely, talking to that specifically. And then the 90-day tactical plan, a close number 2, it's 62% of everybody said, yep, that's high on my list. And then after that, 44% for connecting with key suppliers, getting close to suppliers and customers. That's a really good one. Assessing their supply-based stress and getting at that, really understanding it. So all of these got quite a few picks, gents. So you guys did an awesome job of, picking the right kinds of things that would appeal to industries no matter what their situation. So thank you to the panelists and thank you to the audience for participating. All right, so by now I should have presenter back, and we're going to do a couple of things in closing up. I'd like to do one more really quick polling question, and this is for Next Level Purchasing Association. And, we're continually developing and bringing forward, the leading edge supply and procurement training and development. And just to pop this polling question for a moment too, just like a little quick feedback from our audience who are mainly procurement or related professionals, which of these areas really seem to be most interesting from a learn more about, just in general, aside from what we just covered in the last polling question. So we can run that now, Amber, for just a moment. Just get a little quick feedback, please. And then David would be very interested in that going forward. For those of you who are not familiar with the acronym SCORE, that means Supply Chain Operations Reference Model, if you've never heard of it. Developed by the Supply Chain Council originally and now part of the Apex ASCM organization. All right, Amber, we're close to wrapping that up.
Yes, I'm going to shut down in 10 seconds. We've got a few more that are coming in, the last few more responses. And just want to thank everyone for participating with your responses as well.
Yes, thank you so much.
And here we go.
All right, here we go. Hey, we've got some great feedback here. So transforming the procurement functions effectiveness definitely was the most popular of all of these, followed by design procurement strategy to realize corporate strategy. That's interesting. So it is interesting. We've seen a little difference here from this audience in terms of how they responded to this particular polling question. So thank you so much to our audience. With that, we're going to move on now and get into wrap up and then the final Q&A before we wrap up. So just briefly, one of the things that Next Level has been doing over the last several months is bringing to market an alternative to just off-the-shelf, commercially available, self-paced learning. We call it learn it, do it, which is this notion of customized delivery, multifaceted, mixed mode delivery of training, and actually linking that to corporate strategy and outcomes you're trying to drive. So here's David's phone number and his email in case you'd like to learn more about that. And then we're going to have another webinar coming up in August, and we'll have news coming out about that in not too distant future. So with that, we're in to wrap up and get into the final questions from the audience. So thank you for participating in the polling questions. Get us started. Thank you to our panelists. Awesome job of covering those 3 questions. Thanks for all that feedback at the end. So with that, Amber, let's get into final Q&A.
Sure, I'd love to.
Wrap this up.
Okay. One of the first ones in here is, do you have any advice for finding products for employee safety that are high demand or low supply, but necessary to the reopening process, such as janitorial or sanitation supplies, for example?
Any panelists can jump in. That's a tough one, Amber. Let's move on to the next one.
Okay. How is the education industry going to survive and restart the normal functioning after the pandemic?
The education industry in particular. That is very interesting. So, there's lots of answers to that, and I'm sure one of our panelists will have an idea. But to me, it's recognizing that everything has shifted You know, the ability to have the multi-mode delivery, to be able to work with people from in their homes that would normally be in the office is going to be a really big deal. And if you haven't digitized and found a way to reach a globally dispersed audience more effectively than ever before, you need to. So that's my thought. Any other panelists care to weigh in on that?
Just throw in there that the jobs, look for jobs to change and skill sets to change in the marketplace with this new normal. And I think there's going to be more of a focus on skills versus diplomas to get the job done, and look for opportunities there to grow yourself, and from an education perspective to support that.
Okay, very good. Amber, let's move on to any other questions.
Yes, we do have a few more. This one may be for Bruce. Is there any likelihood of reduction in requirements of procurement professionals in petrochemicals or in oil and gas?
Read that again for me, Amber, will you?
Oh, hold on one second.
Don't lose it.
I already lost it. Yep. Hold on.
Hold on, I can find it.
No, I put it under dismissed. I'm sorry.
Yep. Yeah, I'm looking for it. So,
oh, here we go. Is there any likelihood of reduction in requirement of procurement professionals in petrochemicals or oil and gas?
So I'm not sure what the participant's asking exactly, but if you're looking for oil and gas, kind of where that industry is going as far as career standpoint and how the procurement folks operate within oil and gas, what we're seeing is the oil and gas supply chain folks are becoming actually more integrated into the business model than they were in the past. A supply chain was never important to oil and gas because of the ability to make such great returns. And now that is changing, and they're looking for the supply chain procurement professionals to start, one, doing a better job of managing costs, and also be more strategic in a lot of the business aspects of the oil and gas industry. And we've been seeing that trend for a couple of years now as the oil and gas industry has struggled.
Yeah, based on that, you know, you need to differentiate yourself as a professional to recognize that change is coming and it's coming fast. You know, digital transformation is a piece of that. You know, how is technology going to continue to disrupt what we're doing all across that supply chain? And as a professional, you need to be on top of that. That would just be one of many examples. So you will need to be paying attention to your own skill sets to deal in that new future as it unfolds. Were there any other questions, Amber?
Yes, any thoughts on what's going to happen or what the future of the automotive industry is?
Automotive industry in particular. Interesting. I'm going to take a quick crack at it because I've lived in the Detroit area for most of the last 26 years and very close to the industry. And I think what we're going to see is, you know, a kind of a rapid lift because we had all that mandatory shutdown that went on. You know, the European automakers beat the U.S. automakers coming back online, and the Asians beat them. I don't see, you know, 2019 volumes this year by any means, but I could see it as early as next year. It really has a lot to do with, well, we're in a W recovery, a long U or a sharper V. Those will directly affect. You know, I see automotive is probably a bit more stable, albeit at a lower overall volume. Any other panelists care to weigh in on that?
Yeah, Ron, if I can take a shot at it. 2020 has been such a terrible year across the board, whether it's the political things that are going on, the racial unrest, the pandemic, and the decrease in demand. We're actually working with our CPG clients, and I'm going to put automotive into that, to look for an incredibly robust fourth quarter, because we're all going to be looking for a way to end this year on a really good note with a really good memory. And perhaps buying a new car fits into that category as well. So this is one of these things where if you're in the consumer products industry and luxury goods and those kinds of things, I'd be forecasting a huge upswing in the fourth quarter.
Okay, awesome. Well, with that, Amber, that really gets us to the top of the hour. We probably should wrap it up here.
Yes, thank you all very much, and thanks to all of our attendees for listening in today.
Awesome. Great job, panelists.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. All the
Bye-bye.
best to you.
Thank you, everyone, for attending.
Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.